My name is Rosaline Evans. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my professional life, I've worked in product operations for technology companies. I currently live in Seattle, though I grew up in a much smaller town where people believed competence was something you showed quietly, not something you announced. If you asked most of my coworkers to describe me, they'd probably use words like steady, organized, or helpful. The kind of person who keeps projects moving but rarely raises her voice in meetings. The kind of person who remembers the small details no one else has time for. And, if I'm being honest, the kind of person people sometimes underestimate. Not because I hide what I know, I don't, but because I don't compete for attention the way some people do. In fast moving tech teams, that can create a strange dynamic. The loudest person in the room is often assumed to be the most capable. The person who speaks last, or doesn't speak much at all, slowly becomes part of the background. For a long time, I was comfortable there. My job was to understand systems, the parts of a project that connect everything else together. Communication channels, deployment timelines, documentation structures, and the quiet infrastructure that allows a team to move as one unit when things get complicated. Most of the time, no one notices that work unless something breaks. And in this story, something did break. The situation started with the product launch, the kind that had been scheduled for months, the kind with a client presentation, a live system rollout, and about 30 people watching every update in real time. 5 minutes before the launch meeting, I suddenly lost access to every communication channel tied to the project. The team chat, the internal coordination board, even the private launch room we were supposed to be using with the client. At first, it looked like a technical glitch, but glitches rarely remove access from one specific person while leaving everyone else connected. And that was the moment the situation became very quiet. Because while I couldn't see the messages being exchanged inside those rooms, I understood something else that most people in that meeting didn't. I knew how the system actually worked. The interesting part of the story isn't what happened in that moment. It's everything that happened before it. The months of small decisions, assumptions, and misunderstandings that led someone to believe removing me from a chat room would remove me from the launch itself. This isn't a story about revenge. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, no clever tricks designed to embarrass anyone. It's a story about what happens when people misunderstand quiet competence and discover that the systems they rely on were never as simple as they thought. And more importantly, it's about what you choose to do when you realize someone has tried to quietly erase your place in something you helped build. So before we get into the details, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where people assumed you mattered less than you actually did? In most teams, roles form quietly. Not the official ones written in company directories or job descriptions, but the ones people assign to each other through repetition. The person who always speaks first. The person who challenges leadership. The person who makes everyone laugh during stressful meetings. And then there's the person who keeps everything running while everyone else talks. That was me. When I joined the company 3 years before the launch incident, the product team was already moving fast. New clients, aggressive deadlines, constant feature updates. It was the kind of environment where decisions happened quickly and documentation happened later. or sometimes not at all. My official title was Product Operations Manager, which sounds much more glamorous than it actually is. In practice, my job was to make sure every moving piece of a project could still communicate with every other piece. Workflows, deployment pipelines, internal channels, client facing coordination structures. If something needed to move smoothly between departments, it usually passed through something I had either built or maintained. But because that work happens mostly in the background, most people didn't associate it with the person. They associated it with the system itself. And systems, of course, are supposed to run quietly. My coworkers were not unkind people. That's important to say. There was no daily hostility, no dramatic office politics, no obvious attempts to push anyone aside. What there was assumption. For example, in meetings, I rarely spoke first. Not because I lacked ideas, but because I preferred to understand the direction of the room before adding anything. By the time I did speak, most of the louder voices had already made their points. Sometimes, the conversation had already moved on. People began to interpret that silence in predictable ways. Some assumed I simply preferred operational tasks over strategic ones. Others believed I was naturally supportive, the kind of colleague who helped refine other people's ideas rather than introduce her own. And a few, I suspect, forgot entirely that I had designed large parts of the structure they were using. The person who leaned into that assumption most strongly was Daniel, one of our senior product leads. Daniel wasn't hostile either. In fact, he was often friendly, confident, articulate, and very comfortable speaking in front of clients. The kind of person companies often put forward during launches, because he could turn complicated systems into simple narratives. Over time, he became the most visible face of our project teams, which meant something interesting began to happen. When systems worked perfectly during a client rollout, Daniel was usually the one explaining them. When timelines aligned smoothly, Daniel was the one presenting the roadmap. And because as I rarely corrected that perception, people gradually began to associate the results with the person speaking about them, not the person maintaining them. I didn't resent this, at least not at first. Part of my personality has always leaned toward quiet satisfaction. If something I built allowed the team to succeed, that felt like enough. Recognition was nice, but stability mattered more. Still, there were small moments that stayed with me. Moments where someone would ask Daniel a technical question about an internal workflow he had never actually touched. Moments where he would pause, glance briefly in my direction, and then answer anyway, confidently. Most of the time, he was almost correct, close enough that no one noticed the difference. Except me. Those moments weren't confrontations. They were just small distortions in how the team understood its own structure. And distortions, if they happen often enough, eventually become the version of reality everyone accepts, including the people who benefit from them. At the time, I didn't realize how important that perception would become. But looking back now, I can see something clearly. The team didn't see me as someone who could be removed from a project. They saw me as part of the background infrastructure. And people rarely imagine that the infrastructure might be the thing holding everything together. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. That's usually how these things begin. Not with something dramatic enough to confront, but with something small enough that you quietly file it away and move on. It happened during a planning meeting about 4 months before the product launch. We were sitting in one of the glass conference rooms overlooking the downtown blocks of Seattle. Laptops open, diagrams projected onto the screen. The usual controlled chaos of a product team preparing to scale something that had already grown faster than expected. Daniel was leading the meeting. That wasn't unusual. He had a natural presence when speaking to groups, and leadership often asked him to guide conversations that would later be presented to clients. Halfway through the meeting, the topic shifted to the communication structure for the upcoming launch: internal coordination channels, client update threads, emergency escalation routes. All things I had been quietly designing for the previous 2 weeks. Daniel clicked to the next slide on the screen. A familiar diagram appeared, the exact framework I had sent to the team the night before. 3 layers of communication channels, each designed to prevent information bottlenecks during high-pressure moments. The structure was simple on the surface, but carefully built underneath. I remember noticing 2 things at the same time. First, Daniel was explaining the diagram with confidence. Second, he never once looked in my direction. During the launch, he said, gesturing at the screen, we'll keep the core team inside the primary project chat, while client updates move through a controlled relay channel. That way, we avoid too many voices in one place. A few people nodded. Someone asked how escalation would work if the client had a technical concern. Daniel answered smoothly. We'll route that through the operations layer, so it doesn't interrupt the core development flow. Operations layer. That was me. But he didn't say that. Again, this wasn't a hostile moment. There was no deliberate exclusion, no obvious attempt to claim ownership. In fact, I'm not even sure Daniel realized what he was doing. He was simply explaining a system that already existed. And because no one asked who designed it, the question never entered the room. A younger engineer named Priya raised her hand slightly. Who built the permission structure for these channels? She asked. For a brief second, Daniel hesitated. It was subtle. The kind of pause most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking directly at him. Then he smiled. Oh, that's something we've been refining internally, he said. It's pretty straightforward. I remember feeling something shift inside me at that moment. Not anger, something quieter, clarity. Because the system wasn't straightforward. The permission layers alone had taken me 3 full days to configure correctly. Every channel had role-based access tied to deployment responsibilities, so that if something went wrong during the launch, the right people could communicate instantly without noise from unrelated departments. Daniel moved on to the next slide. The meeting continued. No one asked another question about the structure. No one looked in my direction, and I didn't interrupt. After the meeting ended, a few people gathered their laptops and headed back to their desks. Priya stopped beside me for a moment. Hey, she said quietly. That channel structure looked really clean. I smiled. Thanks. She tilted her head slightly. You built it, right? I nodded. She gave a small laugh. Yeah, I thought so. Then she walked away. That moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. But it confirmed something important. At least one person in the room had noticed the gap between who explained the system and who actually built it. The rest of the team didn't seem to care. And for a while, Neither did I. Because small moments like that happen in every workplace. People summarize each other's work all the time. Most of the time, it's harmless. But small cuts have an interesting quality. On their own, they barely register. You tell yourself it's not worth mentioning, not worth correcting, not worth the awkwardness of interrupting a meeting, just to clarify credit for something that's already moving forward. So you stay quiet. And slowly, without anyone intending it, the story about who does what inside a team begins to shift. I didn't realize it then. But that meeting was the first time someone publicly explained my work as if it belonged to the room instead of to the person who built it. And once a story like that begins, it has a way of repeating itself. After that meeting, nothing dramatic changed. There was no confrontation, no sudden tension in the office, no moment where I decided something had crossed a clear line. If anything, the weeks that followed looked perfectly normal from the outside. That's how patterns begin to settle in a workplace. Not with a single moment that everyone remembers, but with a series of small repetitions that slowly redefine what feels ordinary. Daniel continued leading client facing conversations. I continued maintaining the operational systems behind them. At first, the dynamic still felt balanced. When something complicated happened inside the infrastructure, people would usually turn to me for clarification. My inbox was full of quick messages asking about permissions, workflow dependencies, or deployment timing. So technically, everyone still knew I understood the system. But knowledge and recognition are not always the same thing. The shift appeared most clearly in meetings. Daniel had become the person most comfortable presenting updates to leadership. Because of that, he began summarizing more and more of the team's operational structure during weekly reviews. And every time he did, the same small detail repeated itself. He described the system, but he didn't describe the person behind it. Sometimes it was subtle. We've built a layered communication flow for the client launches. Other times, it sounded more personal. I set up the escalation paths so nothing gets lost during rollout. That second phrasing caught my attention the first time I heard it. Not because it was aggressive. Daniel said it casually, the way people often summarize collective work. But the wording was specific enough that anyone listening might reasonably assume he had configured the structure himself. No one corrected him, including me. There's a strange psychology behind staying quiet in moments like that. Part of it is practical. Meetings move quickly, and interrupting someone to clarify ownership of a system can feel unnecessarily confrontational. Part of it is emotional. No one wants to appear territorial about something the team is using successfully. And part of it is something more subtle. You begin telling yourself the story doesn't matter. After all, the system is working, the team is benefiting, the client is happy. What difference does it make who receives credit? That reasoning sounds reasonable on the surface, but it contains a hidden cost. Every time the story repeats without correction, it becomes a little more stable, a little more believable, a little more permanent. Eventually, even the people inside the system start adapting to that version of reality. I noticed this most clearly during quick hallway conversations. Someone would stop Daniel after a meeting. Hey, that launch channel structure you built is really efficient. He would smile. Thanks, we've been refining it. We. That word gave him just enough flexibility that the statement wasn't technically wrong, but it also allowed the perception to remain intact. I watched these exchanges a few times without saying anything, and each time I told myself the same thing. It's not worth correcting, not worth creating tension, not worth turning a smooth team dynamic into an awkward clarification about ownership. But there was another reason I stayed quiet. One I didn't fully admit to myself yet. I was curious, not about Daniel's behavior, about the team's perception. I wanted to understand how far the assumption would extend. Because people reveal a lot about their understanding of a system when they believe they already know how it works. Around this time, something else interesting began happening. Daniel started making small adjustments to the communication structure during meetings. Nothing major. Suggestions about which channels should include which people. Ideas about simplifying escalation paths. Each suggestion sounded reasonable when discussed at a high level. But behind the scenes, they created small inefficiencies I would later have to quietly correct. At first, I simply fixed them. I adjusted permissions, repaired workflow connections, updated documentation. No announcements, no explanations, just quiet maintenance. But over time, a question began forming in my mind. Not an angry question, a structural one. What would happen if the person describing the system actually had to rely on it without me quietly adjusting the details afterward? I didn't act on that thought. Not yet. At that point, it was just a curiosity, a small observation about how easily confidence could reshape the story of a team's work, and how rarely anyone checked the foundation underneath that story. Looking back now, I can see that this was the stage where the dynamic truly became normalized. Daniel was the visible architect. I was the invisible infrastructure. Everyone seemed comfortable with that arrangement, including me, at least for a while. By the time the launch date moved onto everyone's calendars, the team dynamic had settled into something that felt almost scripted, not officially, but socially. If you watched our meetings long enough, you could predict who would speak first, who would summarize decisions, and who would quietly implement them afterward. Daniel had become the person who explained the system. I had become the person who made sure it actually worked. Again, that arrangement wasn't openly discussed. No one ever said that Rosaline handles the background while Daniel leads the conversation. But the expectation existed anyway. You could see it in small things. When a new engineer joined the team, Daniel usually introduced the overall project structure. He would walk them through our launch process, the layered communication channels, and the escalation flow between departments. He was good at it. Clear, confident, reassuring. Most people assumed the person explaining the system had designed most of it. Meanwhile, my role in those conversations often looked simpler. Rosaline will help you get access to everything, Daniel would say. She manages the operational side. That description wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. Managing operational systems meant designing them, maintaining them, predicting where they would break under pressure, and building quiet redundancies most people never noticed. But once a label becomes comfortable, people rarely examine it closely. Operational side slowly turned into something softer in people's minds. Support, administration, maintenance, reliable work, but not strategic work. And the interesting thing about roles like that is how quickly they become invisible. During planning discussions, people began directing questions about infrastructure toward Daniel first. If the question was complex enough, he would eventually loop me in. Rosaline probably has the exact details, he'd say. I usually did. So I would answer, calmly, briefly, and the meeting would continue. What I noticed over time was that my presence had started to feel optional to some people, not in a hostile way, more like background software running quietly behind the main interface. Necessary, but not central. One afternoon, about 6 weeks before the launch, I saw this perception expressed more clearly than ever. A smaller planning meeting had formed in one of the corner conference rooms. I wasn't originally invited, but someone asked me to stop by quickly to verify something about the deployment timeline. When I walked in, Daniel was sketching something on the whiteboard, a simplified version of our communication flow. I recognized the diagram instantly. It was a compressed version of the structure I had designed months earlier. But something about it had changed. Several of the role permissions were missing. Two of the escalation channels had been merged into one, and the client-facing layer had been repositioned in a way that looked clean visually, but would create confusion if anything urgent happened. Daniel was explaining it with confidence. This way the launch stays streamlined, he said. Too many channels just create noise. One of the marketing leads nodded. Yeah, this looks much simpler. Daniel turned slightly and noticed me near the door. Oh, perfect, he said. Rosaline's here. She can help set this up. There was no question about whether the structure should change. The assumption was simply that I would implement it. I walked closer to the board and studied the diagram for a moment. Technically, I could have built it exactly the way he described, but it would have removed several safeguards I had designed specifically for moments of confusion during high-pressure launches. I considered saying that out loud, explaining the reasoning, correcting the structure before it became real. Instead, I asked one calm question. Do you want the escalation permissions to remain separated? Daniel shook his head slightly. No, let's keep it simple. Everyone in the room nodded. Simple sounded good. Simple always sounds good when you're not the one maintaining the system later. I wrote a few notes in my black notebook. Then I looked up. Okay, I said. And that was the moment I realized something important. The role I had been assigned wasn't an architect. It was implemented. The person who quietly turns other people's ideas into functioning systems. Reliable, efficient, invisible. Most teams have someone in that role, and most of the time, it works perfectly well. But it also creates a strange vulnerability. Because when people believe you're only the implementer, they eventually begin to think the system could exist without you. And that belief would soon lead someone to make a very interesting decision. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a disagreement, or after one of those moments where Daniel summarized my work as if it belonged to the room. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening when most of the office had already gone home. I remember the time clearly because the cleaning crew had just started moving through the hallways. Their carts made soft, rhythmic sounds against the polished floors, and the open office lights had dimmed automatically to their nighttime setting. I stayed late that evening to finalize the launch communication framework, not the version from the whiteboard, the simplified one Daniel had presented, the real version, the one designed to handle stress. Product launches are interesting moments within a company. They compress weeks of work into a few critical hours where information has to move quickly and accurately. If the communication structure fails, the product itself can still function perfectly, but the team will feel like it's collapsing. So I had built the system with multiple layers of quiet redundancy: primary launch chat, client facing channel, internal escalation threads. And behind all of that, permission structures that made sure the right people could move information instantly if something unexpected happened. From the outside, it looked like a handful of chat rooms. From the inside, it was more like a map of responsibilities. I finished adjusting the last permission set and leaned back slightly in my chair. That's when I noticed something small. A message thread between Daniel and one of the engineering managers had appeared in the admin activity log. Normally, I wouldn't pay attention to private conversations. But admin logs are designed differently. They don't show the message content, only the structural changes someone attempts to make. And Daniel had attempted to adjust channel ownership. Not successfully, but the attempt was recorded. I stared at the entry for a moment. Then I clicked into the permissions panel to review what he had tried to change. It looked like he had been experimenting with reorganizing the launch channels again. Perhaps trying to simplify them further. Perhaps preparing something for the client presentation. There was nothing malicious about the attempt, just curiosity from someone who believed he understood the system. Still, the log showed something interesting. Daniel had been working inside the framework without fully understanding how the permissions interacted, which meant something important. He believed the system was simpler than it actually was. I closed the panel and sat quietly for a moment. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me thoughtful. Because when someone believes they understand a system completely, they tend to make decisions with a certain kind of confidence. Confidence that the structure will behave exactly the way they expect. But complex systems rarely behave that way. They contain invisible dependencies, small connections that only reveal themselves when someone tries to move something important. I looked around the office. Most of the desks were empty now. The glow of monitors reflected softly off the glass walls. Somewhere down the hallway, the vacuum cleaner hummed quietly. I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. People rarely test the systems they believe they control. Then I closed the notebook. The interesting part about that moment is what didn't happen. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't send a message asking why he was experimenting with permissions. I didn't even mention the log entry the next day. Instead, something inside me became very still. Not passive, intentional. For the first time since the launch project began, I stopped automatically correcting the small misunderstandings forming around the system. The assumptions, the simplified explanations, the quiet shifts in how people described who was responsible for what. Up until that evening, I had been maintaining the structure and protecting the perception around it. After that evening, I decided to maintain only the structure. Perception could take care of itself. That decision didn't change anything immediately. The team continued moving toward the launch date. Meetings happened, updates were shared. Daniel continued presenting the communication framework as if it was something simple and intuitive. And I continued making sure it functioned perfectly. But internally, something had shifted. For the first time, my silence wasn't just patience, it was an observation. Because I had begun to wonder something very specific. If the team believed the system was simple, what would happen when someone tried to change it at the worst possible moment? After that evening, my silence started to feel different. Before, it had been something instinctive, the natural quietness that comes from preferring observation over interruption. I had always believed that if a system worked well, it didn't need constant explanation. Now, the silence had purpose, not defensive, not resentful, just deliberate. Because once you begin observing a system, whether it's technical or human, you start noticing patterns that were invisible before. Daniel's confidence, for example, had become stronger as the launch approached. The closer we moved toward the client presentation, the more comfortable he seemed explaining the communication structure to others. Leadership liked clarity, and Daniel delivered clarity easily. Everything's streamlined, he said during one update meeting. The team can coordinate instantly without noise. People nodded. Simple systems are comforting to hear about. Behind the scenes, the real structure remained intact. Layered permissions, role-based access, redundancy channels designed to prevent confusion if something unexpected happened during launch. But I stopped interrupting when someone summarized it incorrectly. That was the quiet change. In the past, if someone misunderstood part of the workflow, I would gently clarify. Actually, that permission works slightly differently. Let me show you how the escalation layer is separated. Those corrections weren't dramatic. They were just part of maintaining accuracy. Now, when those moments appeared, I sometimes let them pass. Not recklessly, only when the misunderstanding didn't create an immediate risk. Because I had realized something subtle about team dynamics. When people believe they understand a system, they begin interacting with it differently. Their confidence changes their behavior, and behavior reveals assumptions. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk with his laptop. Quick question, he said, leaning slightly against the divider. Sure. He rotated the screen toward me. A channel list from our internal workspace filled the display. I'm thinking of tightening up the launch room, he said. Too many people might slow down communication. I glanced at the screen. The list showed several of the channels I had configured, including the core launch chat and the client-facing thread. What do you mean by tightening it? I asked. Just cleaning up access, he said casually, making sure only the right people are inside the important rooms. Technically, that was already the case. Every channel had been designed around role-based responsibilities. The right people already had access. But Daniel seemed to believe he was improving the structure. Okay, I said. He waited, expecting more. Usually, I would have explained the permission layers in detail, walked him through the dependencies, shown him why adjusting one room could quietly affect another. This time, I didn't. Instead, I asked a simple question. What problem are you trying to solve? He shrugged. No problem, just making it cleaner before launch. Cleaner, that word again. All right, I said calmly. Just be careful with the admin permissions. Some of those rooms connect to escalation layers. Daniel smiled slightly. Got it. Then he closed the laptop. Thanks. The conversation ended there. What struck me afterward wasn't what he asked. It was what he didn't ask. He didn't ask how the permission layers interacted. He didn't ask which channels were structurally dependent on others. And he didn't ask who originally designed the system. Confidence often removes the need for questions. Over the next 2 weeks, similar conversations happened a few more times. Small adjustments, minor cleanups, quiet reorganizations of access. Each one is recorded automatically in the admin logs. Each one showed the same pattern. Daniel believed he was refining a structure he understood. And every time, I responded the same way, calmly, briefly, without correcting the deeper assumption. From the outside, nothing had changed about my behavior. I still maintained the infrastructure. I still updated permissions when needed. I still made sure every system worked perfectly. But internally, the silence had transformed into something else entirely. It had become space. Space for the team's perception to develop without interference. Space for confidence to grow where understanding was incomplete. Because when someone believes they control a system, they eventually take a step that tests that belief. And when that moment arrives, the system itself will quietly reveal the difference between explaining it and building it. By the time launch week arrived, Daniel seemed more confident than ever about the communication structure, which meant something interesting was about to happen. Not because anyone planned it, but because confidence sometimes invites a very specific kind of mistake. Launch week has a very specific atmosphere inside a product team. Conversations become shorter, messages become more frequent. People begin double checking details they've already reviewed 10 times before. Everyone moves a little faster, but also a little more carefully. From the outside, our team looked exactly like any other group preparing for a major release. Calendars were full, the launch checklist circulated daily, and Daniel was increasingly visible in meetings with the client's leadership. He handled those conversations well. Clear timelines, confident explanations, reassuring summaries about how prepared we were. And technically, he wasn't wrong. We were prepared. But what most people didn't notice during that final week was how much preparation had happened quietly, long before the launch date appeared on anyone's calendar. Complex systems don't become stable overnight. They become stable because someone spends months imagining all the ways they might fail. For me, preparation had always been less about building a structure and more about observing how people interacted with it afterward. The communication framework I designed for the launch wasn't just a set of chat channels. It was a network of permissions, fallback rooms, and role-based access points that ensured information could still move even if one layer temporarily broke. Most people never needed to understand those details. They only needed the system to work. So the visible part remained simple. A primary launch chat where the core team coordinated updates. A client-facing thread where Daniel and leadership communicated progress. A few internal support channels for engineering, operations, and product. From the outside, it looked almost minimal. But beneath that surface, the infrastructure was far more precise. Each channel had ownership rules tied to specific roles. Each role had access permissions connected to deployment responsibilities, and every important conversation had at least one quiet fallback path if something unexpected happened. The interesting thing about systems like this is that they rarely attract attention until someone tries to change them. And Daniel had been changing small things more often as the launch approached. Not dramatically, just the kind of cleanups people make when they believe they're simplifying a structure. Removing someone from a channel who didn't need to be there, reassigning ownership of a thread so it looked more organized, adjusting access lists so fewer people could post messages during the launch. Each change appeared reasonable in isolation. And because admin logs recorded everything automatically, I could see exactly how those changes were evolving. I didn't interfere unless a modification threatened the system itself. Most of the time, the adjustments only affected perception, not function, which made them interesting to observe. One evening, 2 days before the launch, I stayed late again to review the final configuration. The office was nearly empty, just like the night a few weeks earlier when I first noticed Daniel experimenting with permissions. I opened the system panel and began reviewing the channel hierarchy. Everything was still intact, but one detail stood out immediately. Daniel had reassigned administrative ownership of several launch channels to himself. Not unusual. Many product leads prefer that kind of control during a rollout. Still, I examined the permission structure carefully. Ownership carries more power than most people realize. It allows someone to add or remove participants instantly, close channels, create new ones, restructure communication paths. If someone fully understands the system, that control can be useful. If they don't, it can create unexpected results. I watched the permission tree for a moment. Then I checked the fallback layers I had built months earlier. Everything remained active, quietly waiting. At that moment, I felt something very calm settle into place. Not anticipation, not concerned, just certainty. Because complex systems reveal themselves most clearly when someone believes they are simpler than they truly are. I closed the panel and opened my notebook again. Under the previous entry, people rarely test the systems they believe they control. I wrote another sentence. Confidence often edits complexity out of memory. The next morning, the office was full again. Launch day had arrived. Daniel moved between meeting rooms, preparing the client's presentation. Engineers monitored deployment timelines. Marketing teams scheduled announcement posts. The energy felt focused but optimistic. From the outside, everything looked perfectly organized, which meant the team was about to experience the moment every system eventually reaches. The moment where assumption meets structure. 5 minutes before the client's live launch meeting was scheduled to begin, I opened my laptop and checked the project workspace one last time. That's when something unusual happened. Every launch channel disappeared from my screen. For a moment, the workspace looked almost empty. The primary chat, the client thread, the internal coordination rooms, all gone. It took less than 2 seconds to understand what had happened. Someone with channel ownership had just removed my access. Most likely, while reorganizing the rooms. Most likely, believing they were simply cleaning up the participant list before the client joined. And because Daniel now controlled several of those channels. The explanation seemed obvious. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Around me, the office continued buzzing with pre-launch activity. No one else had noticed anything yet. Inside the launch rooms, conversations were probably continuing exactly as planned. But something interesting had just occurred. The person responsible for maintaining the entire communication framework had been removed from it 5 minutes before the most important meeting of the project. For most people, that moment might have triggered panic. For me, it created something else entirely, a quiet sense of clarity. Because while I had lost access to the visible channels, the system itself was still exactly the way I built it. And systems like that rarely depend on a single room. When the launch channels disappeared from my screen, the first thing I did was check the time, 4 minutes before the client meeting. Around me, the office was still moving at the steady pace of a team preparing for something important. Engineers were refreshing dashboards. Someone across the room was quietly rehearsing part of the presentation under their breath. No one looked concerned, which meant the change had probably happened inside the communication rooms themselves, somewhere I could no longer see. I opened the admin activity log. The answer appeared immediately. Channel participant update. Core launch room. Owner, Daniel Hartley. Action. Access removed. Rosaline Evans. Two more entries followed. Client coordination. Thread owner, Daniel Hartley. Action. Access removed. Rosaline Evans. Internal escalation channel. Owner, Daniel Hartley. Action. Access removed. Rosaline Evans. I studied the screen for a moment. The pattern was clear. Daniel had been adjusting access lists again, most likely in preparation for the client meeting, cleaning up participants so only the core voices remained inside the discussion. And somewhere during that process, he had decided I didn't need to be there. The interesting thing is that the decision didn't feel personal. It felt structural. From Daniel's perspective, the launch system was already built. The communication rooms were active. The team understood the process. So removing someone from the channels probably looked like a simple administrative cleanup. After all, if Rosaline handled the operational side, her work was already finished, right? I closed the log and sat quietly for a moment. If you imagine this scene dramatically, it might look like the beginning of a confrontation. A rushed message, a tense walk across the office, an immediate demand to be added back into the rooms. But that's not what happened. Because at that exact moment, I realized something very simple. Daniel hadn't removed me from the system. He had removed me from his view of the system. Those are two very different things. I opened another panel on my laptop, one that very few people in the company ever needed to see. The administrative infrastructure console. This was the layer beneath the communication channels themselves, the structure that connected them to deployment workflows, escalation triggers, and system alerts. Most product leads never interact with this layer directly, not because they aren't capable, but because the interface is complicated. Dozens of small rules connecting permissions, automated notifications, and fallback communication paths are designed to activate when something inside the visible system stops behaving normally. I reviewed the launch configuration calmly. Every safeguard was still intact. The fallback notification layer still connected operational alerts to my account. The deployment monitoring bridge still routed system warnings through the escalation architecture I built months earlier. And most importantly, the automated client support trigger still referenced my operational role. That particular function had been designed for a very specific scenario. If a launch issue appeared during a client meeting, anything from deployment delay to configuration mismatch, the system would automatically notify the person responsible for operational resolution, not the presenter, not the meeting host, the operations architect, which meant something quietly interesting was about to happen. Inside the launch channels, Daniel and the team were probably already discussing final talking points with the client. They believed the communication structure was clean, streamlined, efficient. From their perspective, the system looked exactly the way they wanted it. And in one sense, it was. But complex systems don't rely on what people see, they rely on what they connect to. I opened the live deployment monitor and watched the rollout begin. A new product release always contains small surprises. Nothing catastrophic, just the tiny adjustments that appear when real users begin interacting with something for the first time. Normally, those adjustments move through the communication channels smoothly. But communication channels only function if the right people are present inside them. 2 minutes into the launch meeting, the first system alert appeared. A configuration warning. Minor. Routine. The kind of thing the operations team resolves quietly while the meeting continues. Inside the client chat, someone would notice the alert. They would ask who could check it. And that's when the system would do what it had been designed to do. Not because of anything I had changed, but because the structure was functioning exactly as intended. The automated escalation trigger was activated. My laptop chimed softly. A notification appeared on the screen. Operational alert. Client launch environment. Responsible contact. Rosaline Evans. I looked around the office again. No one seemed alarmed yet. But somewhere inside the launch room, someone had just realized they needed the person responsible for the operational system. The same person who had been removed from every communication channel 5 minutes earlier. I didn't feel satisfaction, just quiet understanding. Because systems don't care about perception. They respond only to structure. And at that moment, the structure had just reminded everyone of something very simple. Removing someone from the conversation doesn't remove them from responsibility. The notification on my screen stayed there for a moment. Operational alert. Client launch environment. The kind of message that normally would have triggered an immediate response inside the launch channels. But the launch channels were no longer visible to me, which meant the system had quietly routed the alert through the only path still connected to the person responsible for operational resolution. My desk phone rang about 30 seconds later. Not my personal phone. The internal line is most teams only used when something needs immediate attention. I picked it up. Rosaline. It was Priya. Her voice wasn't panicked, but it carried that focused urgency engineers get when something unexpected appears during a live rollout. Hey, she said quickly. Are you seeing the deployment alert? Yes. There was a short pause. Can you jump into the launch room? She asked. Another pause. I don't have access to it. Silence filled the line for half a second. What do you mean? I was removed from the channel about 5 minutes ago. Priya didn't speak immediately. I could almost hear her turning towards someone else in the room, processing the information. Then she came back. Okay, she said slowly. Hold on. The line went quiet. Across the office, people were still moving between desks and conference rooms, unaware of the small conversation happening over my phone. Moments later, the call returned. This time, Daniel's voice appeared. Rosaline. Hi, Daniel. He sounded slightly confused. Hey, quick thing. Looks like you got dropped from the launch channel somehow. I waited a moment before answering. That's correct. Another pause. Well, can you rejoin? We've got a config warning on the client environment. Technically, I could have asked him to add me back immediately. That would have been the simplest solution. But simplicity sometimes hides an important choice. Because this moment wasn't just about access to a chat room. It was about something larger. For months, the team had gradually accepted a certain story about how the launch system worked. Daniel explained it. I implemented it. Simple, efficient, interchangeable. Now the system had created a small gap in that story. And Daniel was asking me to step back into the room without anyone fully seeing why the gap existed. If I did that instantly, the moment would disappear. The team would continue believing the structure was simple. The system would quietly function again, and nothing would change. But there was another option. Not confrontation, not an accusation, just clarity. I spoke calmly. Daniel, before I rejoin the channel, I need to resolve the alert directly from the operations console. Right? He said quickly. That works too. I could hear a quiet conversation in the background on his side of the call. The client meeting had probably already started. People were likely looking at the deployment dashboard, waiting for someone to explain the warning. Give me a minute, I said. Okay. I ended the call and turned back to my laptop. The configuration alert itself wasn't serious. A minor environment variable mismatch. Something that happens frequently during first-time deployments. Normally, it would be resolved inside the engineering channel within seconds. But because the communication structure had been adjusted, the engineers inside the launch room were now discussing the alert without direct access to the system layer that generated it. Which meant they were waiting for someone who understood the operational architecture. I opened the configuration panel and corrected the variable quietly. The alert disappeared. System status returned to normal. Then I closed the console. The interesting part of this moment wasn't the fix. It was the timing. Because inside the launch room, the team was still discussing the alert, trying to understand it, explaining it to the client. And just as that conversation reached its most uncertain point, the system warning vanished. No interruption, no explanation, just resolution. My desk phone rang again almost immediately. Daniel again. Rosaline, did you fix something? Yes. A brief silence followed. Then he asked the question that mattered most. How were you able to access the system? I looked down at the notebook beside my keyboard. The sentence I had written earlier still sat there quietly. Confidence often edits complexity out of memory. I answered calmly. Because the launch infrastructure isn't controlled by the chat rooms. Another pause. This one is longer. For the first time since the launch preparations began, Daniel seemed to be realizing something important. The person was removed from the communication channels, was still connected to the system itself. And that realization was about to change the tone of the entire meeting. After I ended the second call with Daniel, the office returned to its usual launch day rhythm. From the outside, nothing had changed. People were still moving quickly between desks. Screens showed deployment dashboards, analytics graphs, and marketing timelines. The product launch was continuing exactly the way everyone had planned. But something subtle had shifted inside the launch meeting room. Not panic, just uncertainty. Because moments earlier, a system alert had appeared in front of both our team and the client, and then quietly disappeared without anyone inside the launch channels resolving it. Except for the person who wasn't in those channels anymore. I didn't rush to rejoin the conversation. Instead, I stayed where I was and continued monitoring the operational console. This wasn't avoidance. It was simply the most efficient place to work from. The infrastructure layer allowed me to see everything happening beneath the communication rooms. Deployment activity, server response patterns, automated configuration checks. From here, the system was perfectly transparent. Inside the launch meeting, however, things were probably less clear. When a warning disappears during a live presentation, people usually ask two questions. What caused it? Who fixed it? Neither question could be answered inside the launch chat because the person who had fixed it wasn't visible there. About a minute later, my internal message notification blinked. Priya again. Priya. Hey, the alert cleared. Did you handle that? I typed a short response. Me. Yes. Three dots appeared almost immediately as she began typing again. Then the message stopped. Started again. Finally. Priya. Daniel's trying to explain what happened to the client. I smiled slightly at the screen. That wasn't surprising. In high-pressure meetings, someone usually fills the silence with a confident explanation, even if the full picture isn't visible yet. Another message appeared. Priya. Can you join the room? They're asking about the system layer. There it was. The natural next step. I could walk down the hallway, enter the meeting room, and clarify everything calmly. The moment would resolve itself. The launch would continue smoothly. But before doing that, I wanted something small to happen first. Not a dramatic realization, just a quiet correction to the story the team had been telling itself for months. So instead of answering immediately, I continued monitoring the infrastructure panel. A few seconds later, the deployment system triggered another small diagnostic check. Nothing serious, just one of the automated validations that runs during early rollout stages. Normally, these pass silently, but this one produced a short informational alert. Inside the console, the message appeared instantly. Inside the launch room, however, it would show up as a small notification on the shared dashboard screen. The kind that invites someone to explain what it means. I watched the log update calmly. Then my phone buzzed again. Daniel this time. I answered. Rosaline. Hey, he said, voice controlled but slightly more focused than before. Quick question. Sure. That diagnostic message on the dashboard, is that related to the earlier alert? I glanced at the console. No. Another pause. So, what does it mean? It's a standard validation check, I said calmly. It confirms the deployment environment is fully synchronized. Oh, his voice softened slightly. Okay, Khasok. Then he asked the question that had been quietly approaching since the beginning of the call. Can you walk us through how the monitoring layer works? There it was. For months, the launch system had been described as simple, clean channels, clear communication. Now the conversation had reached the layer beneath that simplicity. And suddenly, the room needed someone who understood it. I looked down at my notebook again. Then I stood up from my desk. I'll come explain it, I said. When I walked down the hallway toward the conference room, I noticed something interesting. The door was partially open. Inside, the client's leadership team appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. Several members of our team were seated around the table. Daniel stood near the display, mid-conversation. He looked relieved when he saw me step inside. No tension, no accusation. Just the quiet recognition that the person responsible for the operational architecture had arrived. I took a seat calmly and opened my laptop. Sorry, Daniel said to the room. Rosaline manages the infrastructure layer. Not helpful with it, does not support it, manages it. The wording had shifted, subtly, naturally, and without anyone raising their voice or correcting the past. Sometimes, clarity doesn't arrive through confrontation. Sometimes, it appears simply because the system itself has revealed where its real structure lives. The first thing I noticed was not panic. It was silent, not the peaceful kind, the kind that forms when something expected fails to appear, the kind that makes people pause for half a second longer than usual before speaking. The morning after the launch, the office Slack channel was unusually quiet. Normally, after a major client launch, there would be a flurry of celebration messages, emojis, congratulations, quick summaries of what went well. Someone always tried to take credit early, shaping the narrative before the details settled. But that morning, the messages came slower because something was missing, and no one seemed to know exactly what it was. The client's launch had technically succeeded. The system stayed online, orders processed, traffic stabilized after the first surge, but internally something had shifted. It began with small questions. Hey, does anyone know where the updated integration documentation is? I can't seem to access the system logs. Did someone change the permissions on the deployment board? Each message appeared casually, almost politely, but each one carried a quiet thread of confusion. The documentation had always lived in the same place. The system logs had always been accessible to the team leads. The deployment board had always updated automatically after a launch. Except now, the usual shortcuts didn't work, and the people who normally handled those things were suddenly unsure how they worked. I watched the messages appear while sitting at my kitchen table, coffee cooling beside my laptop. No alarms, no calls, just questions. At first, Daniel tried to answer them. His tone in the chat was confident, the way it always was. Give me a minute. Looking into it. Should be an easy fix. But 10 minutes later, another message appeared. Does anyone have the updated credentials? Then another. Where's the rollback script located? The channel went quiet again. Because those weren't small questions. Those were foundational ones. The kind you only ask when you realize the system is more complicated than you thought. For years, I had quietly built small layers of structure around the team's projects, not as control, not as ownership, as stability. Documentation that actually explained the system, backup procedures that worked when something failed. Permissions were structured so that changes couldn't accidentally break the infrastructure. Most of those systems were invisible when things ran smoothly, which is why no one noticed who maintained them, until suddenly they weren't sure how they worked. Around mid morning, a private message appeared on my phone. It was from Claire, the project coordinator. Hey Rosaline, quick question. Do you still have access to the system dashboards? Still, the word lingered for a moment. I typed back calmly. Yes. Three dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Then her next message came through. Daniel said the permissions might have reset during the launch. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened the dashboard on my screen. Everything was exactly where it had always been. Traffic metrics, server health, order queues. The system was running smoothly because the infrastructure had been designed to be resilient. Claire's typing indicator appeared again. Also, the client asked who configured the real-time monitoring panel yesterday. They said it was the only dashboard that actually made sense during the launch. I smiled slightly, not out of victory, out of recognition. Because the client hadn't noticed the office politics. They had simply noticed what worked. A few minutes later, the main channel lit up again. Does anyone know who set up the monitoring panel? Another message followed. I thought Daniel did. Then someone else replied. No, I don't think so. I closed Slack for a moment and leaned back in my chair. The consequences had begun. Not dramatic, not loud. Just small realizations appearing in quiet places. And the strange thing about realization is this. Once it begins, it spreads on its own. Confusion in a workplace rarely arrives as chaos. It begins quietly, with questions. At first, the team believed the launch issues were small, something technical, something temporary. The kind of problem that disappears once the right person presses the right button. But the questions kept appearing. Where are the updated system logs? Why isn't the dashboard syncing? Did the monitoring permissions change? Each message sounded casual. Yet behind them was the same realization slowly forming. The system wasn't as simple as everyone assumed. For years, I had built small layers of structure around the project: documentation, monitoring tools, internal safeguards. None of it was flashy. Most people barely noticed it existed until they needed it. Around mid-afternoon, the client sent a short email asking about the monitoring dashboard that had helped them track the launch in real time. They wanted to understand how it worked. More specifically, they wanted to speak with the person who built it. Inside the team, that request created a quiet tension. Daniel responded quickly in the chat. I'll take the call. Claire asked a simple question. Did you build that dashboard? There was a pause before Daniel answered. I helped set up the deployment. The wording avoided the real question. A few minutes later, Claire sent me a private message. Rosaline, did you design the monitoring panel? I looked at the dashboard open on my laptop. Yes, I replied. She paused before answering. Oh, that single word carried the weight of understanding. Because once the client asked who built the system, the truth couldn't stay hidden anymore. And when the truth arrives in a professional setting, it usually comes with something simple: evidence, documentation, and a very quiet question everyone suddenly cares about: who actually knows how this works? The client call happened the next morning. It was scheduled for 15 minutes. Just a quick review of the monitoring system. Daniel began the meeting with his usual confidence, explaining the deployment environment and the launch process. Everything he said was technically correct, but it wasn't what the client wanted. After a moment, one of them asked directly, "Could the person who built the real time dashboard walk us through it?" Daniel paused. He explained the general monitoring tools again, but the explanation didn't quite answer the question. Claire gently shifted the conversation. Rosaline designed that interface. The room grew quiet for a moment. The client looked at my name on the screen. "Rosaline, did you build it?" "Yes." That was all. From there, the conversation moved naturally. They asked how the dashboard translated server data into simple visuals, how alerts were triggered, and how it could scale for future launches. It was a normal technical discussion, professional, calm. When the meeting ended, only three of us remained on the call. Daniel looked at me. "You built that system quietly," he said. "Yes." He nodded once. "I didn't realize." And that was the entire confrontation. No anger, no drama, just a moment where reality quietly corrected the assumptions in the room. After that meeting, the office didn't suddenly transform. There were no dramatic apologies or speeches. Instead, the change appeared in small ways. People started asking different questions. In meetings, someone would pause and say, "Rosaline, does this affect the monitoring system?" Or, "Maybe Rosaline should review this first." For the first time, the work I had done quietly for years had a name attached to it. Daniel adjusted too. When technical questions about the dashboard came up, he simply said, "Rosaline built that part." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that matters more. My routine didn't change much. I still started mornings reviewing system metrics, checking dashboards, refining small pieces of infrastructure no one else usually saw. But something had shifted. Not in the systems, in the room. People now understood where the knowledge lived. And that quiet understanding changed how they listened. Some people expect stories like this to end with revenge. But that was never what happened. There was no dramatic victory, no public humiliation, only clarity. My coworker didn't try to exclude me because he was a villain. He simply believed something many workplaces quietly teach: that the loudest voice in the room must also be the one in control. But real systems don't work that way. The people who truly understand how things function are often the quiet ones, the ones documenting processes, solving invisible problems, building structures that keep everything running. For a long time, I thought staying quiet meant being overlooked. What I eventually learned is this: silence can also be preparation. When the moment arrives where the truth matters, competence speaks for itself. You don't have to force recognition. Sometimes, you simply build something strong enough that reality introduces you. And I'm curious about something. Have you ever experienced a moment where people underestimated your role until one situation suddenly revealed what you actually knew? I'd love to hear your story.